The fluorescent lights of the city's grand performing arts center always buzzed with a low, steady hum, a sound that matched the constant ringing in Martha's ears. It was 11 p.m. The last of the evening's patrons had spilled out onto the busy streets, their laughter fading into the cool night air. Inside, the silence began to settle, heavy and thick, but Martha was just clocking in. She wasn't here to watch the show. She was here to clean up the mess the show left behind, at 56 years old. Martha moved with a quiet efficiency that made her seem like part of the building's architecture. She wore a faded gray uniform that had been washed too many times, the fabric thinning at the elbows. Her shoes were practical work sneakers, scuffed at the toes, the soles worn down from miles of walking over concrete and carpet. To the people who had sat in the velvet seats just an hour ago, Martha was invisible. She was the one who collected the discarded playbills, the half-empty soda cups, and the occasional lost glove. She was the shadow that reset the world for tomorrow. Martha didn't mind being invisible. It was safer that way. Life on the streets, or in her case, life sleeping in the driver's seat of a rusted sedan parked 3 blocks away, taught you that being noticed often meant trouble. She tucked a strand of graying hair behind her ear and picked up her cleaning cart. The squeak of the wheels was the only sound in the vast lobby as she began her nightly ritual. The lobby of the theater was beautiful, even under the harsh glare of the cleaning lights. There were marble floors that reflected the ceiling-high chandeliers and posters, advertising upcoming symphonies and ballets. Martha paused to look at one of the posters. It featured a young woman in a flowing gown, sitting at a grand piano. Martha remembered when she used to have dresses like that. It felt like a memory from a different life, a different person entirely. That Martha had a house with a garden. That Martha had a piano in the living room. That Martha had a family. She pushed the thought away quickly. It hurt too much to hold on to the past. It didn't pay the bills, and it didn't put gas in the car. She focused on the floor. There was a sticky patch near the box office window, probably spilled soda. She sprayed her cleaning solution and began to scrub. The circular motion of her arm was comforting. It was repetitive. It required no thought. Just scrub, wipe, move on. As she worked, she thought about her day. It had been a long one. She had spent the morning at the community center trying to secure a spot for a shower. The lines were always long, and the water was never quite hot enough. Then she had waited in line at the local food pantry, hoping for something fresh but settling for canned beans and bread. Now, here she was, on her feet for another 6 hours. Her back ached, a dull throb that started at the base of her spine and shot down to her legs. But she had a job. That was more than many of the people she slept near could say. This job was her lifeline. It was the only thing keeping her from disappearing completely. She moved from the lobby to the main auditorium doors. They were heavy, but she pushed them open with her shoulder, entering the cavernous darkness of the hall. The smell here was different, distinct. It was a mix of old velvet, dust, and the faint scent of expensive perfume that lingered in the air. It was the smell of art and culture, a world that Martha observed but never participated in. In the dim light filtering from the emergency exit signs, the rows of empty red seats looked like a sleeping army. Martha walked down the sloped aisle, her cart bumping softly over the carpeted steps. She had a routine for the auditorium. She started from the back and worked her way to the front, checking every row for lost items. People lost strange things. Keys, eyeglasses, once even a denture plate. Tonight, it was mostly candy wrappers and popcorn. She reached the front row, the VIP section. The seats here were wider, covered in better leather. She ran her hand over the armrest, feeling the cold texture. This was as close to the stage as a regular person could get. From here, you could see the sweat on the performers' brows. You could see the dust motes dancing in the stage lights. Martha looked up at the stage itself. It was a vast, empty expanse of dark wood, framed by heavy red curtains. The orchestra pit was below her, a gaping maw waiting for the musicians. Usually, this was as far as she went. Her supervisor, a man named Mr. Henderson who always smelled of peppermint and stress, had strict rules. The cleaning crew was not to go onto the stage. That was hallowed ground. That was for the artists. Martha had always respected that rule. She knew her place. She was the cleaner, not the creator. But tonight, something felt off. The theater felt too quiet, too expectant. As she bent down to pick up a crumpled program from the floor, she heard a sound. It wasn't a sound from the street outside, and it wasn't the building settling. It was a thump, followed by a sliding noise. It came from the stage. Martha stood up straight, her heart rate picking up slightly. She looked around. The security guards usually did a sweep right after the show, but sometimes they slacked off, especially if it was a quiet night. She hesitated. Should she call Mr. Henderson? No, he would just yell at her for disturbing him. She should check it out herself. Maybe an animal had gotten in. A rat? A stray cat? It wouldn't be the first time. She walked down the small set of stairs that led to the orchestra pit. She navigated around the music stands and the conductor's podium, which stood like a silent sentinel. She climbed the short ladder on the other side and pulled herself up onto the stage floor. The floor was smooth and slick, designed to allow dancers to glide across it. Martha's sneakers squeaked as she took a few steps. The stage was vast. From the audience, it looked relatively small, but standing on it, she felt tiny. The ceiling high above was a forest of ropes, lights, and rigging. The darkness here was deeper, swallowed by the black curtains that lined the back wall. Martha squinted, trying to see into the corners. "Hello?" she whispered. Her voice sounded small in the empty space. "Is anyone there?" There was no answer. Just the hum of the air conditioning system somewhere in the walls. She let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. It was probably nothing. Just the building settling into its foundation for the night. She turned to go back, to retreat to the safety of the seats in her cleaning cart. But then she saw it, in the center of the stage. Bathed in a single beam of light that filtered from a window high above, sat a piano. It wasn't the usual upright piano that was pushed to the side for rehearsals. This was a grand piano, a massive, black, gleaming beast that seemed to glow in the darkness. It must have been left out from a rehearsal earlier in the day, or perhaps it was being prepared for a morning recording session. Martha stopped in her tracks. She hadn't been this close to a concert grand in over 30 years. It was beautiful. The curve of the lid was like the wing of a bird. The black finish was so shiny, she could see her own reflection in it, distorted and small. Her hands, usually so busy gripping a mop handle or a trash bag, suddenly felt very heavy and very empty. Martha took a step closer. Against her better judgment, Mr. Henderson's voice echoed in her head. Asterisk, do not touch the props. Do not touch the instruments, asterisk, but this wasn't a prop. This was a living thing. It had a presence, a gravity that pulled her in. She looked around the theater again. The vast emptiness of the seating area stared back at her. There were no cameras that she could see. The security guards were likely in the break room drinking coffee. It was just her and the silence. Just her and the piano. She reached the edge of the instrument. She could smell the varnish and the faint scent of dust that lived inside the wood. It was a smell that unlocked something deep within her chest, a tight knot of emotion that she had kept bound up for years. She remembered the feeling of keys beneath her fingers, the power of creating sound that could move people to tears. She remembered sitting on a bench with her father, his large hands guiding hers, laughing when she made a mistake. That life was gone. The house was gone. The father was gone. All that was left was this uniform, this broom, and this quiet moment on a wooden stage. Martha looked at her hands. They were rough, the skin dry, the nails trimmed short. They were cleaner's hands now. But as she looked at the pristine white keys of the piano, she wondered, just for a second, if they could still be musicians' hands. She didn't sit down. Not yet. She just stood there, looking at the instrument, feeling the weight of her reality pressing down on her shoulders. She was a woman with no address, no savings, and no one waiting for her at home. But in this dark theater, under the faint light of the moon, she was just a woman, standing in front of a piano, remembering what it felt like to be whole. The silence of the hall wasn't empty anymore. It was waiting. It was waiting for her to make a choice. The woman stood there, frozen like a statue in the dim light. The air around the piano seemed to vibrate, though no sound was coming from it. It was just her own heart beating against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that echoed in the huge, empty hall. She looked over her shoulder again, scanning the rows of velvet seats that stretched up into the darkness like a quiet mountain range. There was no movement. The red exit signs glowed softly, casting long, spooky shadows, but there were no security guards. No angry supervisors. Just the dust motes dancing in the moonlight. She knew she should turn around. She should climb back down the steps, grab her cleaning cart, and finish sweeping the lobby. If Mr. Henderson caught her up here, standing in the forbidden zone, she wouldn't just get a stern warning. She would lose her job. And for a woman living in her car, losing a job wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a disaster. It meant the difference between eating and going hungry. It meant the difference between a safe place to park and a dangerous one. But her feet wouldn't move. They felt glued to the smooth, polished floor of the stage. The woman took a small breath and stepped closer. The piano was enormous. Up close, it looked less like a piece of furniture and more like a sleeping beast. The black lacquer was so shiny, it looked wet. She could see her reflection in the side of it, distorted and blurry. Her gray hair was messy from her cap. Her uniform looked baggy and tired. She looked away from her reflection, embarrassed. She didn't want to see the woman she had become. She wanted to remember the girl she used to be. She remembered the piano she had as a child. It wasn't a grand like this. It was an old upright that smelled like mothballs and lemon oil. It lived in the corner of the living room, and every afternoon, her mother would tell her to practice. She used to complain about it. She wanted to go outside and play with the other kids. She wanted to ride her bike. She didn't understand that those hours of scales and drills were a gift. She thought it was a chore. Now, standing here in the silence of the theater, she would have given anything to go back to that living room. She would give anything to hear her mother's voice calling her to practice just one more time. She realized now that the music wasn't just noise. It was a connection. It was a language that spoke when words failed. Slowly, timidly, she reached out a hand. She stopped inches from the keys. Her hand was trembling. It looked so different from the hands she remembered. Her skin was dry and rough from years of scrubbing floors and handling harsh chemicals. Her knuckles were swollen from the cold mornings. These were hands that knew how to hold a mop, how to wring out a rag, how to scrape gum off concrete. They didn't look like hands that belonged on a concert piano. It's just a piece of wood and wire, she whispered to herself. Her voice sounded cracked and rusty in the quiet room. Just look at it. You don't have to touch it, but she wanted to. She needed to. It was a physical ache, deep in her chest. She looked at the cleaning cart parked far down in the orchestra pit. It looked so small and insignificant from up here. The trash bags, the spray bottles, the broom, they were her tools for survival. But this instrument, this giant black machine, represented a life she had lost. A life of beauty. A life where people listened to her. She clenched her hand into a fist and then opened it again, trying to steady the shaking. She took a final, quick look around the theater. The silence felt heavy, but it also felt permission. The building was sleeping. It was keeping a secret for her. She leaned in closer. She could smell the wood and the felt. It was a sweet, dusty smell that made her eyes water. She saw the reflection of her hand hovering over the keys. One finger. Just one finger. What would it hurt? It would be like touching a ghost. A quick touch, and then she would go back to work. She lowered her index finger. It felt like she was moving through water, so slow and careful. The tip of her finger brushed against the white ivory of a middle C. She didn't press it down. She just touched the surface. It was cool and smooth. The sensation sent a jolt of electricity up her arm, straight to her heart. She gasped softly, pulling her hand back as if she had touched a hot stove. The sound of her own gasp scared her. It sounded too loud in the empty hall. She held her breath, waiting for the shout, the flashlight beam cutting through the dark. Nothing happened. The theater held its breath with her. This is crazy, she thought. I'm going to get fired. But the temptation was stronger than her fear. The curiosity was a hunger she couldn't ignore. She had walked away from music 30 years ago when life got too hard. When the money ran out and the grief took over, she had sold her old piano to pay for rent, thinking she would buy another one someday. Someday never came. The music stopped, and she forgot how to listen for it. Until now, she looked at the fallboard. The protective cover that went over the keys. It was closed. Opening it felt like a line she shouldn't cross. It was opening a book she wasn't allowed to read. But she had come this far. She reached out with both hands and gripped the edges of the fallboard. The wood was smooth against her palms. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a second, and lifted. It opened silently, revealing the keys in all their glory. Rows of black and white, perfect and pristine. They weren't chipped or yellowed like the keys of her old childhood piano. They were bright and inviting. They seemed to hum with potential. The woman stared at them. There were 88 keys in front of her. Each one represented a possibility. Each one was a door she had closed a long time ago. She felt a lump form in her throat, hard and painful. She hadn't cried in a long time. She didn't have the luxury of crying. Crying didn't help you find a warm place to sleep. Crying didn't fill the gas tank. But standing here, looking at these keys, she felt the tears stinging her eyes. She sat down slowly on the bench. It was padded and firm. She placed her feet on the gold pedals. Her sneakers looked ridiculous against the gold finish, but she didn't care. She adjusted her posture. It was an instinct she couldn't turn off. Back straight, shoulders relaxed, wrists up. Her hands hovered over the keys, shaking again. She felt like a fraud. Who was she to sit here? She was a janitor. She was invisible. She was tired. Just one chord, her mind pleaded. Just to hear it. Just to remember. She was terrified. Not of getting caught anymore, but of the sound. What if her hands were too stiff? What if the magic was gone? What if she touched the keys and nothing happened? Or worse, what if it sounded terrible? She didn't think she could handle the disappointment. She wanted the memory to stay perfect, but the silence of the stage was urging her on. It was a gentle push from an invisible hand. She lowered her hands. Her left hand found a bass note deep and resonant. Her right hand hovered over a higher octave. She didn't play a song. She didn't have a song in her head. She just wanted to make a sound. She pressed down. The sound exploded into the hall. It wasn't a noise. It was a presence. A single, deep, rich, C major chord that swelled up from the piano and filled every inch of the theater. It bounced off the walls and ceiling, swirling around her like a warm breeze. The vibrations traveled through the floor, up her legs, through her spine, out the top of her head. For a second, the woman wasn't in an empty theater. She wasn't tired. She wasn't hungry. She wasn't homeless. She was weightless. The sound hung in the air, echoing, fading slowly, lingering like a memory. She held the keys down, letting the vibration soak into her bones. She closed her eyes and let the sound wash over her, cleaning her soul better than any mop or broom ever could. It was the most beautiful thing she had heard in 30 years. When the sound finally died away, the silence that returned was different. It wasn't empty anymore. It was satisfied. It was waiting for the next note. The woman opened her eyes. She looked at her hands resting on the keys. They were still rough, still red, but for a moment they looked like piano hands. She let out a long, shuddering breath, and a single tear rolled down her cheek. Splashing onto the white key, she was playing again. She didn't know if she could play a whole song, but she was playing. And in that moment, the world outside, with its bills, its cold nights, and its indifference, it didn't exist. It was just her and the piano and the music. The vibration of that first chord still tingled in her fingertips, echoing in the quiet hall like a ghost that refused to leave. The woman sat frozen on the bench, her hands resting lightly on the keys, afraid that if she pulled them away, the magic would snap shut like a heavy book. Her heart was hammering so hard against her ribs that she thought it might be audible in the silence of the theater. She listened hard for the sound of footsteps, the squeak of a door, the radio chatter of a security guard. But there was nothing. Just the steady, reassuring hum of the air conditioning and the fading ring of the piano. She looked down at her hands. Under the bright stage lights, she could see the damage life had done to them. The skin on her fingertips was rough and calloused from gripping broom handles and scrubbing brushes for decades. There were small scars on her knuckles from encounters with sharp edges and discarded glass. Her cuticles were dry, peeling back from the nail beds. These were the hands of a worker, of a survivor. They were not the hands of a concert pianist. For a fleeting moment, a wave of shame washed over her. She felt like an intruder, a fake sitting on a throne she didn't deserve. "It's foolish," she whispered to the empty room. "Look at you. You're dirty. You're tired." She started to lift her hands off the keys, intending to lower the fall board and flee back to the safety of the shadows and her cleaning cart. But her fingers wouldn't obey. They felt magnetic, drawn to the ivory and ebony. It was as if the piano was holding her there, whispering to her that it was okay. It told her that it didn't care about her ragged uniform or her lack of a home. It only cared about the music. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the dusty, sweet air of the stage. She closed her eyes for a moment and pushed the shame away. She remembered the feeling of the ivory keys under her fingers when she was a little girl, sitting on her father's lap. He had big, rough hands too, hands that worked in a factory all day. But when he placed his hands over hers to guide her fingers, those hands were gentle. They were full of love. "Posture," she could hear his voice say, clear as a bell. "Keep your wrists loose. Don't fight the music." Instinct took over. The woman sat up taller on the bench. She rolled her shoulders back, trying to ease the tension that lived there permanently. She shook her hands out at her wrists, letting the blood flow. She felt a strange sensation in her mind, like a fog lifting. For years, her thoughts had been consumed with survival, where to sleep, how to get warm, where the next meal was coming from. Those thoughts were loud and demanding. But as she prepared to play again, those voices went quiet. She hovered her hands over the keys again, uncertain of what to play. She didn't have any sheet music. She didn't remember complex classical pieces anymore. The notes had faded from her memory a long time ago, replaced by the sounds of traffic and street noise. But she remembered the melody. She remembered the feeling. Her right hand found a note. An E. It was a high, clear note that pierced the darkness. Then her left hand found a C below it. A simple interval. A sound of longing. She pressed down gently, not wanting to attack the instrument, but to caress it. The tone was pure and clean, much nicer than the old upright she had owned as a child. This piano sang for her. She began to play a melody that had no name, something she was making up as she went along. Or perhaps something she had heard in a dream long ago. It was slow and mournful. It was a sad song, the kind of song you play when you are looking out a rainy window, wondering where everyone went. But it was beautiful. The notes flowed out of her, one by one, connecting like drops of water forming a stream. At first, her fingers were stiff. They felt clumsy, like sausages trying to do delicate work. She missed a note, her pinky slipping off the key and hitting the wood with a dull thud. She flinched, waiting for the punishment, waiting for the harsh reality to crash back in. But the piano didn't judge. It just accepted the mistake and let her move on to the next note. "Don't think," she told herself. "Just feel." She stopped trying to control every movement. She let her hands find their way. It wasn't perfect. The timing was a little shaky. The tempo dragged here and sped up there. But there was an emotion in the playing that was raw and real. It wasn't technically correct, but it was true. She played the loneliness she felt standing in line at the soup kitchen. She played the coldness of the nights spent in her car, watching the frost form on the inside of the windows. She played the grief of losing her parents. The silence of a phone that never rang. The music began to fill the vast space around her. The acoustics of the theater were amazing, catching the sound and throwing it back at her, making her sound like a full orchestra. She felt the vibrations in the bench, traveling up through her spine and into her chest. It felt warm. It felt like a hug she hadn't received in 20 years. She started to play a bit louder, testing the limits of the instrument. The sound swelled, rich and full. The bass notes rumbled like distant thunder, while the treble notes sparkled like stars. She closed her eyes and let the music take her away. In her mind, She wasn't in a dusty theater. She was back in her childhood home. The sun was streaming through the window, illuminating the dust motes. Her mother was in the kitchen humming a tune. The house was warm. There was food in the refrigerator. She was safe. The memory was so vivid it hurt. A tear rolled down her cheek, hot and fast, dripping off her chin and landing on her gray uniform. She didn't wipe it away. She kept playing. The music became a prayer, a desperate plea to the universe to remember that she was still here. She was still a person. She wasn't just a homeless woman pushing a broom. She was someone who could create beauty. She was someone who had something to give. As the melody shifted, becoming more complex, her hands surprised her. Muscles she hadn't used in decades woke up. Her fingers stretched for octaves that seemed impossible, finding the notes with a precision that shocked her. Her body remembered what her mind had forgotten. It was like riding a bike, but deeper. It was like the music was stored in her blood, waiting for this exact moment to be released. She played a series of chords, descending lower and lower, creating a sense of falling. It was the feeling of her life falling apart, the slow descent into poverty and isolation. But then her right hand climbed back up the keyboard, playing a hopeful, rising melody. It was the climb back up. It was the struggle to keep going. It was the resilience that kept her waking up every morning. The woman was lost in the sound. She didn't notice the time passing. She didn't notice the ache in her back or the tiredness in her eyes. All she felt was the connection between her heart and her hands. For the first time in years, she felt complete. The emptiness inside her, the void that she tried to fill with cheap food and restless sleep, was being filled with music. It was a temporary fix, she knew. In an hour, she would have to leave. She would have to go back to her car. But for right now, in this spotlight, she was whole. She dared to open her eyes and look at her hands again. They were moving fast, dancing over the keys. They didn't look like cleaning hands anymore. They looked like magic. The reflection in the shiny black piano showed a woman with a look of intense concentration and peace on her face. The stress lines around her eyes seemed to soften. The hard set of her jaw relaxed. She looked younger. She looked like the musician she was meant to be. The song was coming to an end. She didn't plan it, but the melody naturally found its way back to the starting note. She played it slowly, letting the sound hang in the air. Then, with a delicate touch, she played a final resolving chord. It was a soft, gentle ending, not a bang, but a whisper. She held the keys down, letting the vibration ring out until it was barely audible. Then, she lifted her hands and let them drop to her lap. The silence returned, but it was different now. It wasn't an empty, cold silence. It was a peaceful silence, the kind that comes after a heavy rain. The woman sat there, breathing hard, her chest heaving slightly. She stared at the keys, white and black in the spotlight, waiting for her to touch them again. She knew she couldn't stay. She knew she had to go. But she also knew that she had reclaimed a piece of herself tonight. And nobody, not Mr. Henderson, not the city, not her circumstances, could take that away from her. The last chord faded into the darkness, but the feeling stayed in the air like the scent of rain after a storm. The woman sat on the bench, her hands resting in her lap, staring at the black and white keys. Her fingers were tingling, not from the cold, but from the rush of energy that had just poured through them. She felt dizzy, lightheaded, as if she had just run a long distance. Her heart was beating a fast, rhythmic thump against her ribs. She closed her eyes and took a deep, shaky breath. For a few seconds, she allowed herself to pretend. She pretended that the theater was full. She imagined the rows of velvet seats packed with people, all dressed up in their finest clothes. She imagined the heavy silence of a captivated audience, the kind of silence that happens when thousands of people are holding their breath at the same time. In her mind, she could see the bright spotlights shining down on her, warming her skin, turning the dust around her into gold. She wasn't a homeless janitor anymore. She was a master. She was an artist. It was a beautiful dream, so vivid that she almost felt the urge to stand up and take a bow. She wanted to hear the applause. She wanted to hear the roar of the crowd telling her that she mattered, that her life had value. But then, sound from the back of the hall shattered the dream. It was a small click. The sound of a switch being flipped. Suddenly, a work light near the exit door flickered on. It wasn't a spotlight. It was a harsh, fluorescent buzz that washed out the magic of the stage. The woman froze. Her muscles locked up. The panic that had been hiding in the back of her mind came rushing forward all at once. She wasn't a star in her imagination anymore. She was a woman where she wasn't supposed to be. She was an employee who had broken the rules. She was trespassing on holy ground. She jumped up from the bench so fast that she almost tripped over her own feet. The bench scraped loudly against the floor, a grating noise that echoed through the silent theater. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She looked toward the source of the light, her eyes wide with fear. Standing near the soundboard at the back of the room was a young security guard. He looked to be barely 20 years old, wearing a uniform that was a little too big for him. He had a flashlight in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. He looked bored, checking his watch, probably counting down the minutes until his shift ended. The woman's heart sank. This was it. This was the end. She grabbed the edge of the piano to steady herself. She needed to run, to hide, to get back to her cart, but her legs felt like lead. She tried to make herself small, shrinking behind the massive black body of the instrument, but it was useless. She was standing in the middle of a lit stage. There was nowhere to go. The young guard looked up from his watch. He scanned the room, his eyes passing over the empty seats, the heavy curtains, and finally landing on the stage. He saw her. He stopped moving. He looked confused, tilting his head to the side. "Hello." His voice called out. It was young and unsure. "Is someone up there?" The woman wanted to answer. She wanted to say, "I'm sorry, I was just leaving," but her throat was tight. No sound came out. She just stood there trembling. She felt like a child caught with her hand in the cookie jar, but the stakes were so much higher. This wasn't a cookie. This was her dignity. This was her lifeline. The guard started walking down the aisle, toward the stage. Step, step, step. The sound of his boots on the carpeted floor was terrifyingly loud. Each step brought him closer to discovering her secret, closer to ruining everything. "Ma'am," he called again, a little louder this time. "The theater is closed. You can't be in here." The woman's mind raced. She could try to jump off the stage and run the other way, but she wasn't fast. She would never make it. She could try to hide in the curtains, but they were dusty and old, and she would just get caught. She had to face him. She had to face the music. As he got closer, she recognized him. She had seen him a few times before. He was the quiet one, the one who always held the door open for her when she was struggling with the heavy trash bags. He was the one who sometimes slipped her an extra donut from the break room on Sundays. He was just a kid. He reached the front row and stopped. He shone his flashlight directly at her. The bright beam hit her face, forcing her to squint and shield her eyes. She felt exposed, naked, under the glare. She knew what she looked like. She knew her uniform was dirty. She knew her hair was messy. She knew she didn't belong here. "Hey," the guard said, lowering the flashlight slightly. "I know you. You work the night shift, right?" "Maintenance." The woman nodded slowly. She couldn't find her voice. She gripped her hands together in front of her, wringing her fingers nervously. She waited for the anger. She waited for him to yell, to demand to know what she was doing touching the expensive equipment. She waited for him to call his supervisor. "What are you doing up there?" he asked. He didn't sound angry, just curious. "We're not supposed to be on the stage. Mr. Henderson gets mad about that." "I know," the woman finally whispered. Her voice sounded weak and raspy. "I'm sorry. I was just cleaning." It was a lie, and a bad one. She wasn't holding any cleaning supplies. She was just standing by the piano. The guard took a few steps closer, stepping up to the edge of the stage. He looked at her, then he looked at the piano. He looked at the fallboard, which was still open, revealing the keys. Did you touch that?" he asked. The woman felt the tears prick her eyes again. She looked down at her shoes. Yes, she whispered. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to break anything. It was so quiet. She waited for him to tell her to get down. She waited for him to write up a report. But instead, he just stood there. He looked at the piano with a strange expression on his face. I was in the booth, he said, nodding his head toward the back of the theater. I was checking the camera feeds, but I wasn't watching the screens. I was listening. The woman looked up, confused. Listening. Yeah, he said. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. We have really good microphones hanging from the ceiling for the shows. I heard the music. I thought it was a recording at first. It sounded really nice. The woman stared at him. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't firing her. He was complimenting her. You heard me? She asked. I did, the young man said. He smiled a little, a shy, awkward smile. I don't know much about classical stuff. My mom likes it, but I usually listen to hip-hop. But whatever you were playing, it was sad, but it was pretty. It made me stop working for a minute. He looked at her with wide eyes, seeing her differently now. He wasn't looking at the janitor. He was looking at the woman who had made the music. Did you write that? He asked. The woman shook her head. No, I played what I felt. It's been a long time since I played. You play professionally? He asked. She let out a short, bitter laugh. No, not anymore. I haven't touched a piano in 30 years. Until tonight, the guard looked at the piano, then back at her. He seemed to be processing this information. That was a long break, he said softly. You still got it, though. I mean, I don't know, but it sounded good to me. The woman felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the stage lights. It was a feeling of validation. This stranger, this young man, had heard her. He hadn't judged her. He had actually listened. I have to get back to work, she said quickly, the fear of losing her job creeping back in. I shouldn't be here. Please don't tell Mr. Henderson. The guard looked at her, then at the exit, then back at her. He seemed to be thinking. He took a sip of his coffee. Finally, he shook his head. I won't tell him, he said. I don't see a reason to. No harm, no foul, right? The woman let out a breath. She felt like she had been holding for an hour. Thank you, she said. Thank you so much. But he said, holding up a finger, you have to play one more song. The woman blinked. What? Please? He said. He leaned against the edge of the stage, looking like a little kid asking for a treat. I'm stuck here for another 4 hours and it's boring. Just one more? Maybe something happy this time. The woman looked at him, then at the piano, then at the empty seats. The fear was still there, the fear of getting caught, but underneath it was a bubbling joy. She wasn't being kicked out. She was being requested. She smiled, a genuine smile that stretched across her face, cracking the dry skin on her lips.
Okay, she said.
Okay, I will play one more. She sat back down on the bench. The young guard turned off his flashlight and sat down on the front row seat, right in the center. He leaned back, crossing his arms, ready to listen. The woman placed her hands on the keys. Her fingers didn't shake this time. She felt a strength she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't playing for an imaginary crowd anymore. She was playing for this one kid in the front row. She was playing to say thank you. She thought for a moment, and then her hands began to move. She started a simple, bouncing melody. It was a lullaby, one she used to know by heart. It was light and airy, full of hope and sunshine. It was the sound of a new day. As the notes filled the theater, she heard the guard clap his hands softly on his knees to the beat. She closed her eyes and played, letting the music carry them both away from the empty building, away from the cold night into a place where everything was going to be all right. The final notes of the lullaby floated up to the high ceiling of the theater, swirling around the crystal chandeliers before fading away into the silence. The woman kept her hands resting on the keys, letting her fingers linger on the cool ivory for just a moment longer. She was afraid that if she pulled them away, the feeling would vanish, the feeling of being whole, of being heard, of being something more than just a shadow in the hallway. She took a deep breath and slowly lowered the fallboard over the keys. It made a soft, solid click as it locked into place. It was the sound of a book being closed, a story ending. Briskly, she stood up from the bench. The moment of magic was over, and reality was waiting. She couldn't stay here dreaming. She had a job to finish. If Mr. Henderson came in for his morning inspection and found the lobby not swept, there would be no second chances. No matter how beautiful the music was, it didn't clean floors. She walked to the edge of the stage, her sneakers squeaking softly on the glossy wood. When she reached the front row, the young security guard was still sitting there. He hadn't moved. He was looking at the empty stage with a strange expression on his face, like he was trying to memorize what he had just heard. As she climbed down the short steps to the orchestra pit, he stood up. He adjusted his uniform cap, looking a little awkward, like he wasn't sure how to act anymore. He started, then stopped, scratching the back of his neck. That was really something else, ma'am, honestly. The woman gripped the handle of her cleaning cart, her knuckles turning white. She felt shy again, the weight of her reality crashing back down on her shoulders. She looked at her worn-out shoes, then up at his kind face. "Thank you," she said softly. "It was nice to play again." "Thank you for listening. You should play more often," the guard said enthusiastically. "We have this piano here all the time. It just sits there during the day. It's a waste." The woman shook her head gently. A sad smile touched her lips. "I don't think that's how the world works, young man. People like me clean the pianos. They don't play them." The guard frowned, looking like he wanted to argue, but he stopped himself. He could see the tiredness in her eyes, the way she held herself like someone carrying a heavy backpack everywhere she went. He realized that he couldn't fix her life with a compliment, but he could do one small thing. "Well," he said, reaching into his pocket, "I'm on shift until 4 a.m. If you're working in the lobby and you finish early, I won't tell anyone if you want to come back for a few minutes. Just saying. The door is unlocked." The woman looked at him, surprised. It was a small offer, a tiny crack in the door of her closed-off world. "You might get fired for that," she whispered. "I won't get fired," he said with a shrug. "Nobody comes down here at night. It's too quiet." He held out his hand. It was a strange gesture. A handshake between two people from completely different worlds who had met in the middle for a few minutes. "My name is David, by the way," he said. The woman looked at his hand. It was clean and young. She hesitated, then wiped her palm on her pants, trying to clean off the dust before she took his hand. His grip was firm and warm. "My name is Martha," she said. It felt good to say her name, to be known. "Nice to meet you, Martha," David said, smiling warmly. "You play beautiful music." "Thank you, David," she replied. With a nod, she turned her cart around and began to push it back toward the lobby. The wheels squeaked again, but the sound didn't annoy her as much as before. It sounded like a rhythm now. The squeak, the roll, the squeak, the roll. She walked out of the auditorium and into the expansive lobby. The space was huge and empty, looking different than it had an hour ago. Before, it had felt cold and intimidating, a place that judged her. Now, it just looked like a room. It was just walls and floors. It was just a space. She went to work. She swept the marble floors with new energy. She emptied the trash cans. She wiped down the glass doors. Her back still hurt, and her feet were still tired, but the heavy weight in her chest had lightened. It wasn't gone completely. She still had to go outside to her car when her shift was over. She still had to figure out where to get a hot meal tomorrow. But the panic was gone. The feeling that she had lost herself entirely was gone. She realized that she wasn't defined by the uniform she wore or the car she slept in. Those things were just her circumstances. They were the shell. The music was the person inside, and the person inside was still alive. At 4 a.m., her shift ended. Martha punched her time card, the loud clunk echoing in the break room. She hung up her gray uniform and put on her own clothes, a pair of jeans, a thick sweater, and a heavy coat. She packed her few belongings into her bag. She walked out the back exit of the theater. The night air was crisp and cold, biting at her cheeks. The city was quiet save for the hum of a passing taxi and the distant siren of a police car. It was the soundtrack of the streets, a harsh reality. Martha walked the 3 blocks to where she had parked her sedan. It was an old car, the blue paint peeling off the hood, the windshield cracked. It didn't look like much, but it was her shelter. She unlocked the door and slid into the driver's seat. The air inside was stale and smelled of old upholstery, but she had blankets piled up on the back seat to keep warm. She sat there for a long time, just looking out through the cracked windshield at the streetlights. Her hands rested on the steering wheel. For the first time in a long time, she didn't look at her hands with disgust. She flexed her fingers, remembering the feel of the keys. She realized that she couldn't bring the piano into her car. She couldn't take the stage with her. But she could take the memory. She could take the knowledge that even for 30 minutes, she was the master of her own world. She had created beauty out of the darkness. Martha leaned her head back against the headrest and closed her eyes. In the quiet of the car, she didn't hear the traffic or the sirens. In her mind, she was back on the stage. She could hear the music again. She could hear the swell of the strings, the deep resonance of the bass, the clear high notes of the melody. It wasn't a symphony. It wasn't a famous concerto. It was her song. It was the song of the woman who cleaned the stage, the woman who lived in the car, the woman who refused to be silenced. She smiled in the darkness. It was a small smile, but it was real. She wrapped her coat tighter around herself and drifted off to sleep, humming a soft, silent tune, her fingers gently tapping a rhythm on the steering wheel. The night was still cold, and tomorrow would still be hard, but she had her music back. And in that moment, it was enough to make her feel like she was home.